In 1955, just days before his death, Albert Einstein whispered a secret to his nurse that was never revealed to the public. A classified journal, kept hidden in Princeton University's archives for nearly 7 decades, was finally discovered last month by researchers clearing out a sealed vault. What we found completely contradicts everything we thought we knew about Einstein's views on spirituality and the afterlife, confessed Dr. Richard Hawthorne, head of quantum physics at MIT, after reviewing the document. The world's greatest scientific mind had apparently been concealing his most profound beliefs about consciousness surviving death, beliefs that would have shattered his reputation among the scientific community of his time. The room was dimly lit when I arrived at the Princeton Historical Society's private collection room. Rain tapped against the windows like impatient fingers, creating an atmosphere of anticipation as the curator placed a worn leather journal on the table before me. "You have exactly 2 hours," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "This document hasn't been processed through official channels yet." The journal's pages were yellowed, covered with Einstein's unmistakable handwriting, the same hand that had scribbled ERMC2 and revolutionized our understanding of the universe. But what I was about to read would prove even more revolutionary than his theory of relativity. As I carefully turned the first page, dated March 11, 1955, exactly 1 month before his death, I felt my hands trembling. "Today, I must confess what I have known for decades but feared to share," Einstein had written. "The universe is not merely stranger than we suppose, but stranger than we can suppose. And consciousness, that great mystery, I now believe extends beyond the physical brain." I glanced up at the curator, who nodded solemnly. "Keep reading," she urged, her voice barely audible over the rain. Einstein's journal continued. "Physics has led me to certain knowledge that what we perceive as solid matter is mostly empty space, vibrating at specific frequencies. But in my private experiments I've told no one about, I've detected something beyond these vibrations. Something that suggests consciousness itself operates on quantum principles that transcend the limitations of the physical brain." The journal detailed how Einstein had been conducting secret experiments in his Princeton home, using modified electroencephalogram equipment to measure what he called thought waves that seemed to operate outside the conventional boundaries of the brain. "I have recorded these patterns during moments of deep meditation, and remarkably, similar patterns appear in the moments near death. This cannot be coincidence," he wrote. The journal's pages revealed a different Einstein than history remembers, a man torn between his public persona as the rational scientist and his private explorations into consciousness. "Bohr and Heisenberg understand parts of this puzzle," he wrote, referring to his famous quantum physics contemporaries, "but they too fear the ridicule of suggesting that consciousness may be fundamental to the universe rather than merely an emergent property of neural activity." In one particularly striking entry from February 1955, Einstein described a near-death experience following a severe cardiac episode. "For approximately 3 minutes, according to my nurse, my heart stopped. Yet I experienced a continuation of awareness, indeed an expansion beyond anything I had known. I found myself observing my own body from above, watching the doctors frantically working to revive me. More remarkably, I perceived a kind of unified field of consciousness that seemed to underlie all of reality. It was as if the equations I had been seeking my entire life were suddenly revealed not as mathematics, but as direct experience." I paused in my reading, looking up at the curator with what must have been an expression of astonishment. She simply nodded again. "There's more," she whispered. "Much more." Turning the page, I found detailed notes where Einstein attempted to reconcile his experience with quantum physics. "The observer effect in quantum mechanics suggests consciousness plays a fundamental role in collapsing wave functions into physical reality," he wrote. "But what if consciousness itself is not generated by the brain, but merely filtered through it? My calculations suggest that information, the basic unit of consciousness, cannot be destroyed, only transformed. If this is true, then what we call death may be merely a transformation of conscious information from one state to another." As the rain intensified outside, I discovered entries where Einstein had secretly met with spiritual leaders from various traditions, a Tibetan Buddhist monk, a Kabbalist rabbi, even a Hindu Swami, comparing their experiential knowledge with his theoretical frameworks. The Swami described consciousness as a field that permeates the universe, Einstein noted. When I showed him my equations regarding the unified field, he smiled and said, "You have found with numbers what we have known through meditation for thousands of years. I must consider the possibility that these ancient traditions contain empirical truths discovered through different methodologies than our Western scientific approach." "Professor, do you truly believe consciousness survives physical death?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair, the recorder between us capturing every word of our imagined interview. Einstein's piercing blue eyes seemed to look through me rather than at me. "I have moved beyond belief to understanding," he replied, his German accent still pronounced despite decades in America. "Consider this. When you observe a wave in the ocean, you perceive it as a distinct entity. It has a beginning, middle, and apparent end when it crashes upon the shore. But does the water cease to exist? No, it merely changes form, returning to the greater body. Consciousness may operate similarly. What we perceive as individual awareness may be like a wave pattern in a greater ocean of consciousness. Death may simply be the individual wave pattern returning to the underlying field." The journal contained multiple diagrams where Einstein had attempted to model this theory mathematically. "I have derived equations suggesting that consciousness operates at a quantum level, where time as we understand it does not exist," he wrote. "At this level, past, present, and future exist simultaneously. This may explain reported phenomena such as precognition and the life review many near-death experiences report, a non-linear experience of time consistent with my theories of relativity when applied to consciousness." Most shocking was Einstein's admission that he had been conducting these investigations since the 1920s, simultaneous with his public work on unified field theory. I compartmentalized these explorations, knowing the scientific community would ostracize me for pursuing such questions. But as death approaches, I find the courage to integrate these seemingly disparate aspects of my research. "But surely, Professor, as a scientist, you require empirical evidence," I pressed in our constructed dialogue. Einstein's journal revealed his response. "Science deals with the measurable, yes. But consciousness itself is what does the measuring. This creates a paradox. The instrument cannot fully measure itself. We need new methodologies that bridge objective measurement with subjective experience. I've been developing such approaches in secret, fearing the ridicule of my colleagues. When Max Planck said consciousness is fundamental and matter is derivative, he was ostracized. I remained silent, lacking his courage, but my own experiments have confirmed his intuition." The journal detailed how Einstein had collaborated with neurologists who were studying patients with near-death experiences. Dr. Callahan's patients consistently report similar experiences: a tunnel, a light, encounters with deceased loved ones, and a comprehensive life review. Most significantly, some return with verifiable information they could not have obtained through normal sensory channels. "How does the materialist paradigm explain this?" Einstein had written. "The data suggests consciousness can operate independently of the brain under certain conditions. This aligns with my quantum theories regarding non-locality and entanglement. Consciousness may be fundamentally non-local, merely appearing localized during physical life." According to the journal, Einstein had conducted private correspondence with Carl Jung about the collective unconscious, finding parallels between Jung's psychological observations and his own quantum theories. Jung's archetypes may be quantum information fields that the brain accesses rather than creates, Einstein speculated. This would explain the remarkable similarities in myths and symbols across cultures separated by time and geography. We may be receivers of consciousness rather than generators of it, an idea that revolutionizes not just physics, but our entire understanding of human experience. Lightning flashed outside the window as I turned to a page dated April 12, 1955, just 6 days before Einstein's death. The handwriting was shakier, but the intellect behind the words remained razor-sharp. "As my body fails, my conviction grows. Consciousness is not produced by the brain but focused through it, like light through a prism. When the prism breaks, the light continues. I have mathematically modeled how information, the fundamental basis of consciousness, cannot be destroyed according to quantum principles. What changes is merely the form, not the essence." In this final entry, Einstein described meeting with a colleague from the Institute for Advanced Study who had lost his son the previous year. "I shared my research with him privately. showing him the equations that suggest consciousness continues. He wept and said, "Albert, if only you would publish this." I replied, "The world is not ready, but someday they will be." The journal revealed Einstein's prediction that by 2025, advances in quantum physics and neuroscience would begin to scientifically validate his private theories. The generation that follows mine will discover the quantum nature of consciousness. 2 generations later, they will begin to measure it. By the early 21st century, science will be forced to confront the evidence that consciousness is fundamental to reality and continues beyond physical death. As I read these words, I couldn't help but think of recent developments in quantum biology and consciousness studies that indeed seem to be moving in precisely the direction Einstein predicted. If this is true, Professor, it would transform our understanding of human existence, I suggested in our imagined conversation. Einstein nodded thoughtfully, his wild white hair seeming to capture the electrical energy of his thoughts. "This knowledge would free humanity from the fear that dominates so much of our thinking," he replied. "When I formulated EEMC2, I showed that energy and matter are interchangeable. Now I understand that consciousness itself may be a form of energy, perhaps the most fundamental form, that cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Death would then be not an ending, but a phase transition, a change of state rather than a termination of existence." The most astonishing section of the journal detailed Einstein's attempt to create a mathematical model for this transformation. "I have calculated that consciousness operates in at least 11 dimensions, only 4 of which we normally perceive. The additional dimensions may account for reported afterlife experiences, consciousness continuing to function in dimensions beyond our conventional spacetime. Einstein had even sketched a complex geometric model representing how consciousness might transition between dimensional states at death, with equations suggesting that information contained within consciousness would be preserved across this transition. The universe appears to be constructed not merely of matter and energy as we once thought, but of information as a fundamental component. And information, unlike matter, can exist independently of its physical substrate." Another entry described Einstein's clandestine meetings with Wolfgang Pauli, the renowned quantum physicist who shared Einstein's interest in the connection between physics and depth psychology. "Pauli believes, as I do now, that the division between mind and matter is artificial," Einstein wrote. "We discussed how synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by cause and effect, may be manifestations of the underlying unity of consciousness and physical reality. His concept of the psychoid realm, where mind and matter merge, aligns with my mathematical models of consciousness as a field phenomenon that interacts with but is not produced by the brain." The journal contained detailed accounts of Einstein's experiments, attempting to measure subtle energy fields around living organisms, what some traditions call the aura or biofield. "I have developed specialized equipment capable of detecting electromagnetic variations that conventional instruments cannot," he wrote. "The readings spike dramatically during meditation, emotional states, and most significantly, in the moments before death. Something measurable is happening that extends beyond normal physiological processes. The data suggests an energetic component to consciousness that can potentially exist independently of the physical body." Most surprising were Einstein's detailed accounts of his sessions with a medium named Sarah Goldstein, whom he initially consulted with extreme skepticism. "I designed protocols to eliminate fraud," he noted. "I wrote questions on paper sealed in envelopes that only I had handled. Remarkably, she provided answers that corresponded to information only my deceased friends would have known, specific conversations and events that occurred in private. While I cannot rule out some form of telepathy with living minds, the specificity of the information challenges even that explanation. I must consider the possibility, however disturbing to my scientific worldview, that some aspect of consciousness persists and can communicate after physical death." I was startled by an entry from January 1955 describing a visit from David Ben-Gurion, Israel's prime minister, who had come to Princeton to persuade Einstein to become Israel's president. "We discussed much more than politics," Einstein wrote. "Late into the evening, Ben-Gurion shared Kabbalistic concepts about consciousness that parallel my emerging theories. The ancient Hebrew concept of nephesh, the soul that survives bodily death, may have a scientific basis in quantum information theory. More remarkable still was his description of Gilgul Neshamot, the recycling of souls, which bears striking similarities to my mathematical models of consciousness, transitioning between states of energy and information. In one of the most personal entries, Einstein reflected on the death of his first wife, Mileva Maric. On the anniversary of her passing, I experienced something that defies conventional explanation, he wrote. While working on equations late at night, I distinctly felt her presence in my study. More than a feeling, there was a measurable drop in room temperature and a subtle electromagnetic disturbance that my instruments recorded. For several minutes, I felt as if we were communicating without words. She seemed to guide my hand as I worked through a particularly difficult calculation, one that had eluded me for weeks. The solution came suddenly and completely. When I checked my work the next morning, it was flawless. Was this merely my subconscious mind at work, or something more? The experience has profoundly affected my understanding of consciousness and its potential continuation after physical death. The journal included Einstein's reflections on quantum entanglement and its possible connection to consciousness. I once called it spooky action at a distance and rejected the implications, he wrote. Now I see entanglement may be the key to understanding consciousness. If two particles once connected remain instantaneously correlated regardless of distance, could the same principle apply to consciousness? My calculations suggest that neurons in the brain may achieve a state of quantum coherence that connects them to the larger field of consciousness. Upon death, this connection may persist even as the physical brain deteriorates. Perhaps most compelling was Einstein's account of experiments with Kirlian photography to capture what he called energy signatures of living organisms. The patterns we've recorded persist momentarily after a leaf is cut or an organism dies, he noted. This suggests an energetic component that briefly outlasts the physical structure. If consciousness operates on similar principles, it may continue long after the brain ceases functioning. My colleague at Princeton has developed more sensitive equipment that detects these energy patterns for significantly longer periods post-mortem. The implications are staggering. As my allotted time with the journal neared its end, I found myself reading faster, trying to absorb every insight from this extraordinary document. Einstein had concluded, "I who have devoted my life to understanding the physical cosmos now find myself convinced that consciousness itself may be the unifying principle I have sought. My unified field theory should have accounted not just for electromagnetism and gravity, but for consciousness itself as a field property of the universe. This will be the next great scientific revolution, though I shall not live to see it. But I die with the comfort of knowing that while my body will return to the stars that forged its elements, my consciousness will continue its journey, a wave returning to the cosmic ocean, but never truly lost." In his final entry, dated just 3 days before his death, Einstein wrote with trembling hand, "The mathematics is conclusive. What we call life and death are merely different expressions of the same underlying reality. Consciousness cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. As my time in this particular form comes to an end, I feel not fear but curiosity about the transition. The greatest adventure lies ahead. I regret only that I cannot share these discoveries publicly, as the world is not yet ready to integrate this knowledge with our scientific understanding. Perhaps in 70 years, when this journal might be discovered, humanity will have evolved enough to embrace these truths without fear." The curator finally tapped her watch, signaling that my time was up. As I reluctantly closed the journal, my hands still trembling from what I had read, she leaned in close. "What will you do with this information?" she asked. I considered the magnitude of Einstein's hidden beliefs, how they might transform our understanding of both science and spirituality if made public. "The world deserves to know," I finally replied. Einstein himself predicted that by now we would be ready for this knowledge. I carefully placed the recorder in my pocket, knowing I held perhaps the most significant interview never actually conducted. Einstein's final confession from beyond the grave about the nature of consciousness and its continuation after death. As I left Princeton that rainy afternoon, I found myself looking at the world differently. The people passing on the street, the trees swaying in the wind, the clouds drifting overhead, all seemed connected by an invisible field of consciousness, just as Einstein had described. His lost diary didn't just contain scientific theories, It offered a profound hope that our existence doesn't end when our bodies fail. That night in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Einstein's final words in the journal. Death is not an extinguishing of the light. It is simply putting out the lamp because the dawn has come. I wondered how the world would receive these revelations, how they might transform our collective understanding of life's greatest mystery. 3 weeks after my encounter with Einstein's journal, the scientific community remains divided. Some dismiss the journal as elaborate fiction or the ramblings of a brilliant mind in decline. Others, particularly quantum physicists who have reviewed Einstein's equations, are taking his theories seriously. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a quantum consciousness researcher at Cambridge, stated yesterday, "Einstein's models align remarkably well with our current understanding of quantum biology. We're finding increasing evidence that quantum effects play a role in consciousness, potentially allowing for the kind of information preservation after death that Einstein described." The debate has spilled beyond scientific circles into philosophy, theology, and popular culture, forcing us all to reconsider our assumptions about the nature of consciousness and what happens when we die. As you read these words, quantum researchers at Princeton, Harvard, and the Max Planck Institute are reviewing Einstein's hidden journal, preparing to test his theories using technologies that didn't exist in his lifetime. Could the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century have discovered the greatest spiritual truth of all time? If Einstein was right, death is not the end of our story. It's merely a transition to another state of being, as natural and inevitable as a wave returning to the ocean. The implications are profound not just for science, but for how each of us lives our lives in the face of mortality. If this account moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Comment below with your thoughts on consciousness and the afterlife. Could Einstein's final discovery be his most important contribution to humanity? The truth, like consciousness itself, demands to be known.